Dust of Your Rabbi. The blessing prayed over someone who was leaving their family to follow a rabbi was that they would walk in the dust of that rabbi, that they would stay so close to the rabbi as they listened to his teaching that the very dust of his feet would fall on them. It's only at that close distance that the person who was called could hope to live a life that was worthy of that calling. And that's what we're being challenged by God to rise to, particularly at the moment. The verse that we've been particularly drawn to over the past few weeks is this. It's Paul saying, "I beg you to lead a life worthy of your calling, for you have been called by God." That's Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. A life worthy of your calling. That's such a timely challenge when society is so fractured by aggression and animosity and mistrust and division. The challenge, of course, is to live lives that are recognisably Christ-like, recognisably like Christ. And because the one who calls you is faithful, according to 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 24, a life worthy of our calling is a life of faith. A life of being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not yet see. Of having confident assurance. Wouldn't you like to go through life with an air of confident assurance? Well, the reality is that's how it's supposed to be. That is the life of faith. Now, on the basis that not many of us actually go through life with confident assurance, how do we get to that place? Or to put that another way, what is it that holds us back from that genuine life of faith? Well, the life of faith grows not by avoiding doubt, but by overcoming doubt. We tend to understand doubt as being sinful and showing that we lack faith. It's certainly true that the Bible tells us in, multiple places not to doubt. But actually, doubt can be a very creative place, so long as it's honestly admitted to. Just as you don't grow patience without encountering long delays and learn to be patient as a result, so you don't grow real faith without encountering situations where that faith is really tested and where you have real challenges to what you believe. And it's only in confronting those challenges honestly and holding fast to God during those times that your faith really grows strong. The life of faith grows not by avoiding doubt, but by overcoming doubt. It grows at the point that we admit what one father admitted to Jesus. His son was afflicted by some demonic spirit, and Jesus' disciples had no success in getting rid of it. In desperation, the father approaches Jesus himself and says, "If you are willing, you can make me well," or you can make him well. "What do you mean, if I can?" Jesus asks. "If I'm willing. Anything is possible if a person believes." The father instantly replied, "I do believe, but help me not to doubt." That's Mark chapter 9, verses 23 to 24. And it's that intersection between belief and doubt that we all need to come to and choose which direction we're going to take nevertheless. Doubt, if it's honestly admitted to and not allowed to be the limiting factor in our walk with God, can be the launch pad for living a life worthy of our calling. Even John the Baptist discovered that doubt could be that launch pad. John's two disciples found Jesus and said to him, "John the Baptist sent us to ask, are you the Messiah that we've been expecting? Or should we keep looking for someone else?" That's Luke 7, verse 20. Imprisoned and assaulted by doubt, he didn't go into denial, but rather he was honest about the doubt. And Jesus absolutely didn't count that against him. Jesus' view of John was this: I tell you, of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John. Don't avoid your doubt. Overcome your doubt by owning up to it and choosing to follow Jesus nevertheless. A life of faith grows as we choose our confession carefully. In other words, as we choose a positive confession. But the most common form of negative confession is moaning. Because there are so many unfairnesses in life, aren't there? There are so many stupid managers and bosses out there. So many examples of things being done wrongly. Bankers getting bonuses while the rest of us pays sacrificially for their mistakes. Politicians whose policies are ruining our lives. It's so hard not to just get into a rut of moaning about everything. The Christians at Colossae were no different. The city they lived in was morally corrupt, with the city officials far more concerned with keeping the peace than standing up for what was right. Moaning about the state of affairs in Colossae was probably quite normal. But Paul warns them, live wisely among those who are not Christians and make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be gracious and effective so that you'll have the right answer for everyone. It's tempting to moan about the weather, the economy, the education system, the health service, the criminal justice system, and so on. Everything looks so negative, doesn't it? There's a lot to moan about. But at the end of it all, aren't we supposed to be the bringers of good news? Aren't we supposed to be bringing people hope? Let's take that a bit further. What's your language like when you're under pressure? What's it like when you're facing really daunting, difficult situations? Sometimes the language of Christians descends into something that would make an atheist blush. It doesn't increase a Christian's credibility, it reduces their effectiveness as witnesses, which is particularly dear to Paul's heart, which is why he says, watch the way you talk. Let nothing foul or dirty come out of your mouth. Say only what helps, each word a gift. Why is this important? Because if we don't follow this advice, it effectively closes the door on what truly helps us when the future looks bleak or circumstances looks difficult, which is, let your roots grow down into him and draw up nourishment from him, so that you will grow in faith, strong and vigorous in the truth you were taught. Let your lives overflow with thanksgiving for all he's done. You know what really decides the direction you're going to go in when circumstances are tough and things look worrying? It relates to the reason that God allows those tough circumstances in the first place. The real decider for the direction we're going to take, whether or not we're going to live a life worthy of our calling, is the question that God poses in those times. 4 words that strike to the heart of the Christian life and the heart of the challenge to persevere. Will you trust me? Now, I know from personal experience that I only take that question really seriously when the circumstances around me are truly difficult, daunting. I know personally that when things are going really well in my life, I tend to pay lip service to that question. You know, of course I trust you. Why wouldn't I when things are going so well? But what about when things aren't going so well? Well, then You've let me down. How can I trust someone who lets me down? It's at that point that I can make a choice to do what everyone else does and start moaning and reaching for other things to hold on to, or draw up nourishment from where my roots have gone down into. The reality is, it's only in the daunting, difficult times, the times when we really need to persevere, that the place where our roots are really residing is revealed. So, confront the doubt honestly, resist the temptation to moan, and the third way that Paul handled things in the many tough, daunting situations he found himself in: surround yourself with community, especially those who understand grace. You know, there's never a shortage of what the Bible calls Job's comforters, people who can point out what you've done wrong or why you haven't come up to the mark with God. Paul would regard it as absolute madness for us to surround ourselves with that sort of person. He surrounded himself with just the opposite. He made sure that the people he prayed with and looked to for support were grace-filled people. Let's look at just a sample of them from the last few verses of his letter to the Colossians. There was Onesimus, the runaway slave. You can find out a lot more about Onesimus by reading Paul's letter to Philemon. Philemon, if you recall, was one of the leaders of the church at Colossae. He opened his home to be used as a place of worship by a number of the believers in that city. Philemon was a slave owner, as so many people were in the Roman Empire, and had experienced what a lot of slave owners had experienced. One of his slaves had stolen property from him and had run away. Now, the incidence of runaway slaves was actually quite high, and to deal with the problem, the Romans hired professional slave catchers to hunt down runaways and posted advertisements in public places giving precise descriptions of fugitives and offering rewards for their capture. Around the necks of the slaves who were recovered, they also attached iron collars, giving instructions on what to do with the slaves who wore them if they happened to escape again. Onesimus was one such runaway. He'd made his way from Colossae to Rome and had come across Paul, and subsequently he became a Christian. His life was so impacted by that he was now planning to voluntarily return to Colossae to face the music. And Paul wrote a letter to Philemon to let him know of the changes that had happened in Onesimus and to treat him accordingly. As he put it to Philemon, perhaps you could think of it this way: Onesimus ran away for a little while so you could have him back forever. He is no longer just a slave. He is a beloved brother, especially to me. Now he will mean much more to you, both as a slave and as a brother in the Lord. Onesimus had had some really tough breaks in life and had experienced the unmerited love and had started to experience the love that only Jesus Christ can offer. So he was just the sort of person that Paul wanted as part of the community around him. Of course, more than that, Paul wanted God's will to be done, and he recognized that part of the journey that God had for Onesimus was to be reconciled to Philemon. So he makes the sacrificial decision to release Onesimus to do what God had called him to do. He says, I'm also sending Onesimus, a faithful and much loved brother, one of your own people. He and Tychicus will give you all the latest news. Now that's a big sacrifice for Paul, because people who understand grace, people who have experienced God's forgiveness and unconditional love, well, they're rare indeed. And they're very precious. When you're facing a difficult and challenging future, people who understand grace are just the sort of people who want to seek out, who you want to seek out and ask to pray for you. So the question is, who do you know who understands grace? And an even more important question is, do you understand grace? Can you be that grace person to someone else, someone who's experiencing a daunting time at the moment? Well, Paul also made sure that he had John Mark with him. Onesimus had been a runaway slave, and John Mark had been a runaway disciple. Another person who got grace. See, he was Barnabas' cousin, and Barnabas had been encouraging him to take some first steps in ministry. So when Barnabas and Paul had gone on their first missionary trip, they'd taken John Mark along with them. But as anybody who's been on a missionary trip will know, they're tough assignments, they're tough experiences. And John Mark, who was a young man and young in the faith as well, wasn't prepared for all the hardships, and he got homesick. And so a short way into the trip, he turned back. He turned his back on them and he went home. Now, Paul and Barnabas were planning now their second missionary trip, and Barnabas says to Paul, let's give Mark another try. Let's give John Mark another try. I'm sure he's learned from his mistakes. But Paul didn't see things that way. He didn't want to take that risk again. And so we read Paul disagreed strongly, since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not shared in their work. Well, their disagreement over this was so sharp that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed for Cyprus. That experience of leaving Paul and Barnabas was not what filled Mark with grace. What filled Mark with grace was realizing what he'd done wrong, why it had happened, repenting of it, and experiencing God's forgiveness and new start. That's what filled him with a fresh appreciation of God's grace. And that's what released him into the real ministry that God had got for him in his life. Early tradition highlights him as being the interpreter for Peter in Rome and the founder of the church in Alexandria. Right now, he's become very special to Paul, who's recognized the work of God's grace in his life, how God has restored him and grown him in maturity. And that's all that Paul needs to see to welcome him back into the fold. So Aristarchus, who is in prison with me, sends you his greetings, and so does Mark, that's John Mark, Barnabas' cousin. As you were instructed before, make Mark welcome if he comes your way. Paul was very strategic when he chose whom he wanted to have fellowship with. He chose people who had come through personal challenges and who were therefore grace-filled people. He specifically chose people with a past, people who'd done wrong in the past, because they are the most open to God's healing grace, and so the most encouraging support he could possibly have. He recognized that in them because, of course, he was such a person. He'd started life as a judgmental Pharisee and had come to realize how wrong he'd been. He'd come to repentance, received forgiveness, and started a new life. And he recognized the need to surround himself with other people like that. He's just mentioned Aristarchus in that mention of Mark. Well, Aristarchus was another person with a past, but for a different reason. Aristarchus was the companion with the track record of loyalty. Now, he'd been a travelling companion of Paul for a number of years and had experienced the same hardships that Paul had experienced. Like, for instance, when they were in Ephesus and became the centre of a riot. A crowd began to gather and soon the city was filled with confusion. Everyone rushed to the amphitheatre, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, who were Paul's travelling companions from Macedonia. And that was a scary time. They could well have been torn limb from limb. And God used experiences like that to form a cast iron friendship between Aristarchus and Paul. It was a friendship that was built on a common experience of the grace of God. They had together experienced miraculous escapes from rioting crowds, from huge storms at sea that had threatened to drown both of them. Like Luke mentions in Acts chapter 27, and Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a boat whose home port was Adramyttium. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province of Asia. Well, of course, what happened was that they were caught in a huge storm and were shipwrecked on the island of Malta. It forged a bond between the two of them, a bond of common understanding and confidence that God was able to save whatever the circumstances. And Paul drew upon the encouragement of each of these people and others to help him cope with the difficult situation of being in chains in Rome, waiting to be executed. These were Paul's 3 tactics for growing a life of faith. He learned the value of confronting and overcoming his doubts. He chose not to succumb to moaning because he knew that effectively meant he could not experience drawing nourishment from God. And he surrounded himself with grace-filled people. It worked. Paul led a life worthy of his calling for the following 7 years, right up until, under Emperor Nero, he was beheaded. This is the life that I aspire to, not the being beheaded part, but the life of faith. It's the life that I'm called to, and so are you. So may the dust of your rabbi fall on you, and may you and I live lives that are worthy of our calling. And I pray for each one of us in that calling to walk so closely to our rabbi that his dust falls upon us, to live lives that are worthy of our calling, that calling of faith, that calling to be grace-filled, overflowing with grace to others. Lord, may I live that life increasingly. May each one of us live that life increasingly. May we increasingly be known by the dust that is upon us as belonging to Jesus, reflecting him, living lives that are worthy of the calling that you have on our lives. And I pray that for me, for you, for all of us, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I hope this series on the dust of your rabbi has been helpful to you. I hope it helps you in your walk, perhaps to get a bit closer to the rabbi so that his dust really does begin to fall on you. And I hope you'll stay with us as we embark on a whole new series of talks very soon. And you can find lots of different talks on our YouTube channel. that you can get to by subscribing to the YouTube channel or via our resources page on our website. So I hope that we meet again soon, and in the meantime, God bless you.